The Trump administration is squaring off against Fed Governor Lisa Cook at the Supreme Court today over President Trump's effort to fire Cook. Fed governors, of both parties say independence of American monetary policy itself is at stake.
The Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments about the legality of President Donald Trump's attempted firing of U.S. Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook.
Trump is facing a Supreme Court crisis that just became catastrophically worse, and the timing could not be more devastating for him. The Supreme Court is expected to issue a ruling this week on Trump's tariff powers that could completely destroy his ability to threaten countries like Denmark over Greenland. And oral arguments just happened on whether Trump can fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, with the court already blocking the firing while the case proceeds. Multiple Supreme Court deadlines are forcing Trump to respond immediately. Deadlines on tariffs that could derail his entire foreign policy strategy. Deadlines on the Fed that could strip his power to control monetary policy. And Trump's legal team is in absolute chaos trying to figure out how to respond to judges who aren't intimidated by his threats. But real quick, before we get into this, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built John Brown's show, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, please subscribe, because you might think you are, but aren't. Your subscription actually matters here. All right, let's get into what's actually happening, because the tariff case is expected to get a ruling this week, and analysts on Wall Street are predicting the Supreme Court will rule that Trump does not have the power to impose tariffs the way he's been doing. The expectation is the court will say the president doesn't have authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose these massive tariffs without congressional approval. And here's why this matters so much right now. Trump just threatened to impose tariffs of 10% on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Finland, rising to 25% on June 1st, until Denmark agrees to a complete and total purchase of Greenland. That's Trump using tariff threats to try forcing a NATO ally to sell him sovereign territory. Think about what that means. But if the Supreme Court rules this week that Trump doesn't have the legal authority to impose these tariffs, then his entire Greenland strategy collapses. He can't threaten Denmark with tariffs if the Supreme Court says those tariffs are illegal. He can't pressure European allies economically if the court strips that power away. And during oral arguments on the tariff case, justices appeared skeptical of Trump's power to impose tariffs this way. Multiple justices questioned whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act gives the president this kind of unilateral authority, whether Trump can declare economic emergencies and then impose whatever tariffs he wants without going through Congress. The court's skepticism during oral arguments suggests they're preparing to rule against Trump, to say these tariffs exceed presidential authority, to require Trump to get congressional approval before imposing major tariffs on trading partners. And that ruling could come this week, could drop any day now. And when it does, Trump's entire economic leverage strategy gets destroyed. Trump has been using tariff threats as his main tool for foreign policy, threatening Mexico with tariffs over immigration, threatening China with tariffs over trade, threatening European countries with tariffs over Greenland. But if the Supreme Court says you can't do that, you don't have that authority, then what leverage does Trump have left? And at the same time, Trump is dealing with the Federal Reserve crisis. Trump tried to fire Lisa Cook, who serves on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Cook is one of 7 people who sets monetary policy for the entire United States, who decides interest rates, who controls whether the economy grows or contracts. Think about what that means. And federal law says the president can't just fire Federal Reserve governors. They have fixed terms. They're protected from removal, except for very specific reasons like inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. The whole point of the Federal Reserve's independence is that presidents can't fire board members just because they disagree with monetary policy decisions. But Trump tried to fire Cook anyway, said she's out, remove her from the board, and Cook sued, said the firing violates federal law protecting Federal Reserve independence, and a federal district judge agreed, issued an order blocking Trump from removing Cook while the case proceeds, said the firing appears to violate constitutional separation of powers and Federal Reserve independence. And Trump's administration went to the Supreme Court asking them to pause that lower court ruling. to allow Trump to fire Cook immediately while the legal battle continues. And the Supreme Court said no. The court announced they would hear oral arguments in January on the issue, but they're leaving the lower court order in place, which means Cook stays on the Federal Reserve Board. Trump can't remove her, not until the Supreme Court rules on whether he has that power. And those oral arguments just happened January 21st. The Supreme Court heard Trump's lawyers argue that the president has constitutional authority to fire anyone in the executive branch, including Federal Reserve governors, that laws protecting Fed independence violate separation of powers, that Trump should be able to remove Cook immediately. Share this with everyone and Cook's lawyers argued the opposite, said allowing Trump to fire Federal Reserve governors would transform the Fed into a body subservient to the president's will, would destroy the independence that's protected monetary policy for decades, would let presidents manipulate interest rates for political reasons rather than economic reasons. Think about what that means. And based on the Supreme Court's recent decisions in similar cases, the outcome is uncertain. The court has allowed Trump to fire other independent agency heads. Let him remove members of the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, all positions that were supposed to be protected from presidential removal. So Trump's lawyers are arguing Cook's situation is the same, that Federal Reserve governors shouldn't have any more protection than these other independent agency heads, that Trump should be able to fire her just like he fired everyone else. But Cook's lawyers are arguing the Federal Reserve is different, more important, more central to the economy. That Fed independence has been a cornerstone of American economic policy since the Federal Reserve was created. That letting presidents fire Fed governors would fundamentally change how monetary policy works in ways that could catastrophically damage the economy. And here's what makes both of these cases so devastating for Trump right now: the timing. These rulings are expected in the next few weeks. The tariff ruling could come this week. The Fed ruling could come shortly after. And both decisions will either expand Trump's power or severely limit it. If the Supreme Court rules Trump doesn't have tariff authority, then his entire foreign policy strategy based on economic threats collapses. He can't pressure Denmark on Greenland, can't threaten Mexico over immigration, can't use tariffs as leverage against China or anyone else without going through Congress first. And if the Supreme Court rules Trump can't fire Lisa Cook, then Fed independence is preserved. Trump loses the ability to control monetary policy by threatening to fire governors who don't lower interest rates the way he wants. The Federal Reserve remains independent, and Trump has to accept that interest rates are set by the Fed, not by presidential decree. Think about what that means. But if the court rules the other way, if they say Trump does have these powers, then everything changes. Trump can impose whatever tariffs he wants on whoever he wants, can use economic threats to force other countries to comply with his demands, can fire Federal Reserve governors and replace them with people who will set interest rates based on what Trump wants politically rather than what the economy needs. And that's why these cases matter so much, because they're about the fundamental scope of presidential power, about whether Trump can act unilaterally on major economic decisions or whether he needs Congress, whether he can control the Federal Reserve, or whether the Fed remains independent. Make sure you're subscribed to John Brown's show because legal experts are watching both cases extremely closely. Constitutional scholars saying these rulings will define Trump's presidency, will determine whether he can govern through executive action or whether courts and Congress constrain him. And Trump is clearly panicking about the outcomes. His Justice Department investigating Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. Trump personally attacking judges who rule against him. Trump posting threats about Greenland and tariffs, trying to project strength while waiting for Supreme Court rulings that could strip his power. Share this with everyone because the tariff case in particular has massive international implications. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, it doesn't just affect Greenland. It affects every tariff threat Trump has made, every economic pressure campaign. Countries that were worried about Trump's tariff threats can relax because the Supreme Court would be saying he doesn't have that authority. Think about what that means. Mexico wouldn't have to worry about tariffs over immigration. China wouldn't have to worry about new trade war escalations. European countries wouldn't have to negotiate under threat of economic punishment, because Trump's main leverage tool would be gone. Stripped away by Supreme Court ruling, he doesn't have congressional authorization for these tariffs. And the Fed case has equally massive domestic implications. If Trump can fire Fed governors, then every future president can do the same. Every administration can pack the Federal Reserve with political loyalists. Interest rates become tools of presidential politics rather than independent monetary policy. That fundamentally changes how the American economy functions. Economists are warning if Fed independence gets destroyed, it could trigger financial crises. Markets depend on knowing the Fed makes decisions based on economic data, not political pressure. If investors think presidents can fire Fed governors who don't cut rates before elections, that undermines confidence in the entire system. Stock markets could crash, interest rates could spike, the dollar could weaken, all because investors no longer trust Federal Reserve independence, all because Trump successfully argued he should be able to fire governors who don't do what he wants. So these Supreme Court decisions aren't abstract legal questions. They have real concrete impacts on foreign policy and domestic economy, on whether Trump can threaten Denmark, on whether interest rates stay low or go high, on whether the Fed remains independent or becomes a presidential tool. And the Supreme Court knows this, knows these rulings will be analyzed for decades, knows they're deciding fundamental questions about presidential power in ways that affect every future administration. That's why they agreed to hear both cases, why they're taking oral arguments seriously, why they're not just rubber stamping whatever Trump wants. Think about what that means. During the tariff oral arguments, justices were skeptical. Asked tough questions about whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act really gives Trump this kind of authority, whether declaring economic emergencies to impose tariffs is what Congress intended when they passed that law. And during the Fed oral arguments, justices seemed divided. Some appeared sympathetic to Trump's argument about presidential removal power. Others seemed concerned about destroying Fed independence. The outcome is genuinely uncertain, which means Trump doesn't know if he's about to get a huge win or a devastating loss. And that uncertainty is killing Trump politically, because he can't make firm plans, can't promise his base he'll force Denmark to sell Greenland if he doesn't know whether his tariff threats are legal, can't promise to control interest rates if he doesn't know whether he can fire Fed governors. So Trump is stuck waiting for Supreme Court rulings that could come any day, rulings that will either vindicate his entire approach to presidential power or completely destroy it. And there's nothing he can do but wait. Can't pressure the Supreme Court the way he pressures Congress. Can't threaten justices the way he threatens senators. Just has to wait for them to rule. Share this with everyone, because while Trump waits, other countries are watching. Denmark is watching the tariff case to see if they actually have to worry about Trump's threats. China is watching. Mexico is watching. Every country Trump has threatened with tariffs is waiting to see if the Supreme Court says those threats are legally enforceable or just bluster. And the Federal Reserve is watching the Cook case. Other Fed governors wondering if they could be next. Wondering if Trump gets the authority to fire Cook, whether he'll use that authority to purge anyone who doesn't support his economic policies. Whether Fed independence survives or dies based on this Supreme Court ruling. Think about what that means. The international implications are staggering. If Trump loses the tariff case, his entire foreign policy approach collapses overnight. Every threat he made becomes meaningless. Every negotiation he started from a position of economic leverage becomes something he has to restart on equal footing. Countries that were scared of Trump's tariff threats suddenly realize they don't have to be. Trump can bluster all he wants, but without legal authority to impose tariffs, his threats are empty. And that fundamentally changes how other countries interact with the United States. Changes power dynamics, changes negotiations. Bottom line is this: Trump is facing Supreme Court crisis on multiple fronts, with rulings expected any day that could destroy his power. Court expected to rule this week on tariff authority, and analysts predict they'll say Trump doesn't have power to impose tariffs without congressional approval. That ruling would derail Trump's entire Greenland strategy, would strip away his ability to threaten Denmark with economic punishment, would undermine every tariff threat he's made to any country, would require him to go through Congress for tariff authority. Supreme Court already heard oral arguments on whether Trump can fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. Court left lower court order in place blocking the firing while case proceeds. Oral arguments showed justices divided on whether presidents can remove Fed governors. If court rules against Trump, Fed independence is preserved. Trump can't control monetary policy by threatening to fire governors. Interest rates remain independent of political pressure. If court rules for Trump, Fed independence dies. Every future president can pack the Fed with political loyalists. Both cases have massive implications. Tariff ruling affects foreign policy and Trump's leverage with other countries. Fed ruling affects domestic economy and whether monetary policy stays independent. Rulings expected within weeks. Could come any day. Trump panicking because he doesn't know outcomes. Can't make firm plans without knowing if his powers will be upheld or destroyed. Stuck waiting for Supreme Court decisions he can't control or pressure. Other countries watching to see if Trump's threats are legally enforceable. This story continues. Stay tuned.